All right. I'm gonna take a roll today. Let me borrow your pen here. Okay, Joshua. She's not sure either. Harrison. What's going on here? Jean-Luc. Joseph. Bentley. Mark Bergeron. Nathaniel Bly. Of course. Okay. Stephen. Stephen's not here. Oh. Drew. Julius. Joseph. Luke. Rachel. Jackson. Nicholas. Canella. Thomas. True. John Ortman. Tavio. Alex. Caroline. Sarah Strauss. Kevin. So what's going on today? Grace. Elaine. And Brianna. Okay. Did I get any Jackson? Okay. All right. Well, we were talking about democracy and deficit the last time that we were, before I gave back the midterm. And so the point was to put what you learned about in macroeconomics into a public choice framework. And the idea was that we said that Adam Smith said, what is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. And what he was saying was that if you ran deficits, then at some point you keep selling the bonds, and at some point, if you have too much debt out there, people aren't going to buy the bonds. And so his point was that you would, if you had an emergency or you had some situation where, let's say you were building a bridge or something that was going to take a long period of time, then you could sell bonds to do that, collect the revenues, the tax revenues over the time that the bridge was in place, and you would balance your budget over the long haul. And then basically what happened was Lord Keynes comes along and writes the general theory of employment, and he says, hey, you know what could happen is that you could be in a situation where you have some sort of price index here, like the CPI, and you have real output here, Q, and you have aggregate demand that looks like this, right? And that was your ECON 203 or 304, and then said, okay, here's what could happen is the aggregate supply curve could be here, and here's full employment. And the problem could be that aggregate demand could be equal to aggregate supply, but you're at less than full employment, right? So what was the idea? The idea was that, okay, what was aggregate demand? It was made up of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. If you sort of think back, this number, exports minus imports, is pretty small. The exports might be relatively large and imports might be relatively large, but the difference between the two is relatively small. So you probably focused in 105, we focus on this too, but consumption, investment, and government spending. So the idea is, what are you supposed to do? Keynes said you got to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, all right? And so you want to make aggregate demand go up to aggregate AD prime and get to full employment. Well, what do you want to do? To increase consumption, you're going to reduce taxes and increase government spending. That's what you want to do. So if you're in a recession, what does Keynes say to do? You run deficits, right? Deficits are a good thing. And he introduced this idea of the paradox of thrift. And what is the paradox of thrift? It says that if what happens is you people save and you don't consume, okay? So, right? So if you save more, you're going to consume less. Well, what was the idea? The idea was that if you increase savings, and we have interest rates here, we have a demand for loanable funds and a supply of loanable funds. What would happen is the interest rates would fall, right? So that if you save more, interest rates would fall. And then what would happen? Investment demand would go up. But what was the idea? The idea was that you got caught in this liquidity trap, right? And you sort of think back from ECON 203, they probably talked about liquidity trap. And what was the liquidity trap? The liquidity trap says that, right, at some point, lower interest rates do not increase investment, right? Because investment comes not only from interest rates, but also from your belief about what's going to be going on, your belief of what's going to happen. So that if you, for example, had a restaurant and you were deciding whether to expand the restaurant business, interest rates go down, but we're in the COVID problem, right? And so now you go, okay, even though the interest rates are falling, I'm still not going to invest, right? So the interest rates falling may not increase investment demand. And so that gives you this paradox of thrift. That is, if you save more, consumption's going down, but investment demand doesn't go up because the interest rates are falling, okay? So what did he say? You know, this is sort of this, Keynes talked about animal spirits, right? And what do you mean by that? That is, you know, there's investment demand depends on other things, right? Not just on interest rate. And so it may be that you're at a point in the economy where falling interest rates isn't going to increase investment demand, and that's the paradox of thrift. And so the idea then is, okay, how does the government step in and fix that problem, right? The government steps in to fix that problem by running fiscal deficits, right? Increasing government spending and reducing taxes. And so that is so pre-Keynes, you didn't have macroeconomics, right? There wasn't a, if you took this for 1920, you wouldn't be taking a class in macroeconomics, okay? But, you know, once Keynes shows up, then the idea is that, oh, we should look at the aggregate demand. We should look at total demand for goods and services. And if that's not equal to the aggregate supply, it could get stuck there. They could get stuck at this equilibrium. And so what is the solution? The solution is for the government to step in. Now, this model is almost as if what you're doing is you're giving economic advice to a benevolent dictator in some sort, right? That is, when you took Econ 203, what did you do? You made up a model, right? You had, you know, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m, and then you said c was equal to a plus by minus t, right? and you had, you know, a bunch of equations there. And the idea was to solve for what would the full employment GDP be, and then you'd plug in for government spending and you'd plug in for taxes, and you could get to the right number, right? Or you could figure out what the interest rate ought to be to get. You had some formula, you know, so investment is some function of the interest rate, right? And so the Federal Reserve could get together with the head of the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and they could get together and they could figure out what you should be doing. Now, what Buchanan and Wagner came along and said, but you know what? We need to put this in a public choice perspective, right? And those of you who went to Dr. Skousen's talk, he talked about Buchanan and Wagner's book, Democracy in Deficit, which they wrote in 1977. And they basically said, hey, let's put this all in a public choice perspective. If we think back to when we were talking about Wicksell, right? What did we say that Wicksell suggested? What did Wicksell suggest? When you're doing if I'm trying to figure out how much tax and spending to do, what did he say? You guys answered that on the first midterm, yeah.
That the expenditure and the source of revenue should be voted on at the same time, and it should be, ideally, it'd be a perfect 100% agree, but since that's something that let's take.
Exactly, right? So the idea was that here's the taxes, here's the expenditure, and you vote out at the same time, and you'd like to get near unanimity. So what was Wicksell saying? Wicksell was saying, hey, you got to know what your share of the tax burden is for this thing. If we're going to have an infrastructure bill, which just passed, and President Biden either signed it today or he is signing it. And what is that going to do? That's going to spend over $1 trillion in infrastructure. So if we were going to do that under Wicksell, what would we do? We would have said, okay, here's what we're going to spend the money on, and here's what everybody's tax burden is going to be. That didn't happen, right? You didn't know what your tax burden was going to be when we passed this infrastructure bill. We didn't even know that we're going to increase taxes to do it, right? Maybe what we're going to do is just going to run a deficit to do that. And so Wicksell made the point that when you're looking at how much you're going to spend on government services, you have to sort of know what your share of the cost is going to be. And if you had an efficient institutional arrangement, then citizens would take account of the cost of a government service when they decided to vote in support of it, right? So the idea is that citizens should take into account the cost of a government service, okay? When you're making a decision and do that simultaneously with the benefits, okay? Right, and then compare to the benefits. Well, of course, that's not how we do that, right? So if we're going to look at a government bill that's going to increase government spending, what can you do? So this expenditure bill that we just had, this infrastructure bill, how do we pay for that? Right, one of the things it's going to do is it's going to provide increased internet services for rural areas, and in particular to Native American reservations. Okay, and so there's some benefit to that. What is the cost of that? And then figure out how we're going to pay for that. And the way you could pay for it, right, is you could tax, right? You could borrow, or you could print money, right? Just increase the, you don't have to print the money, but we could call increase the money supply. Now, what Buchanan and Wagner point out is that when the federal government borrows money, think about that, when the federal government borrows money, the people who buy the bonds do so voluntarily, right? You decide if we run a $1,000 deficit and the federal government sells a $1,000 bond, then when you go to buy that bond, you voluntarily say, yeah, I'm gonna loan the government $1,000, and then 30 years later, I'm gonna get my money back, or 10 years later, or 2 years later, depending on what the treasury note is, I'll get my money back. So that people who, when there's a borrowing, the people who lend do so voluntarily. But 2 years from now, when that 2-year treasury note comes due, what happens? We tax you to do that, right? So people who pay the taxes, they have to pay those taxes back when this note becomes due. So what Buchanan and Wagner are pointing out is that the people who are lending the money under a borrowing scheme are doing so voluntarily, but who's paying it off is you guys. You're going to have to pay taxes to do that, and you don't do that voluntarily. You can do it voluntarily. I don't know if you've ever filled out your tax form. There is a place on your tax form where you can give more money than you actually need to pay in taxes if you want. I don't do that very often, but you know, the possibility is there. But basically, taxation is what is it? Pay taxes in the future, right? So somebody in the future is going to end up having to pay that tax. So what does debt allow you to do? It allows you to change the time sequence between outlays and payment, right? And that's true of any debt, whether it's private debt or public debt, right? So what does debt do? It affects the time sequence between when you have the outlays and when you have the payments. And that may be something that you want to do. Suppose that you have World War II, okay? Then what do you have? You have this emergency, and you want to spend a whole lot of money right now, right? And you don't have the money coming in from the taxes. I could have World War II, and I could massively increase taxes in order to fund the war, okay? Or what I could do is I could spend the money now, borrow, and then pay it off over a lengthy period of time. Let's say we think the war is going to last 5 years, okay? If we think the war is going to last 5 years, then we say, okay, let's spend $50 trillion now, and we'll pay that off over a 10 or 15-year period in the future. So if we have an emergency, then this thing may make sense. Or if you have this infrastructure bill, I mean, if we said, hey, this infrastructure bill is going to run a let's say $1 trillion deficit, okay? That's what some of the people are complaining about, right? That it's just going to increase the debt. We're not raising taxes in order to pay for this. We're not reducing spending on other goods and services to pay for this. But what if the infrastructure lasts over a long period of time? So I build a road, and that road's going to last for 30 years. Well, it makes sense to borrow the money in order to do that, right? Because if you have if we're looking at infrastructure in particular, suppose you have a road that lasts 30 years. then maybe what you want to do is pay it off over 30 years. Because the people who are, 15 years from now are going to be using the road, right? They're going to be paying for the taxes that pays for the road. Suppose that we didn't borrow, we paid for the road right now. All you guys are paying for the road, and then what happens? You graduate from Hillsdale College, you go off to Louisiana, and now you're living in Louisiana, and let's say it was a Michigan, a Michigan road. You move off to Louisiana, and now you guys aren't using the road, but you had to pay all the taxes for the road. So if a road lasts 30 years, if you borrow, you're effectively spreading the cost over the future users. So if you're looking at the Republicans and what they're doing is saying, oh, this infrastructure bill is going to increase the debt, and saying that's a bad idea in and of itself, it may not be a bad idea in and of itself. If what we're doing is we're building truly infrastructure that's going to last over a period of time, it would make sense to pay for it over a period of time so that the people who are using it as it goes along will be paying for it. Now, if you individually borrow money, notice that you have a personal liability. You go out and you borrow money to buy a car, okay? When you decide to buy a car, you borrow, now you got to borrow, say, $20,000, okay? Car prices are going up very high. But say you borrow a car, you buy a car and you borrow to do that, you have a personal liability, right? You know that you're going to be the one that pays for it. Now, if what happens is, let's say you are in the government, if the government goes out and borrows money, what is your personal liability, right? You don't have a personal liability. You don't know exactly how much you're going to have to pay. So when the government borrows money, the difference between private borrowing, right? If you have private borrowing, you have a personal liability. But if you have the government borrowing, you're not assigned a particular liability. And you may feel that, well, you're not going to have to pay very much for this infrastructure bill, right? You don't know when you're deciding whether to support the chairman's mark on this bill. You don't know exactly what your own personal liability is going to be, and so you might be able to escape the cost in the future by just a couple obvious things. Is you could escape this liability by moving. Right? You leave, okay? Or one way to do it, in which we haven't done a lot of analysis on, but if this is sort of an interesting topic, is immigration. That is, if a whole bunch of new people come in, right? If we open up the border with Mexico and lots of people from Mexico come in, then what would happen? Well, then we'd be spreading the cost of that debt out over more people, and we would be gaining from that. So you don't really hear this as an argument for a more open immigration policy, but if you think about it, it could make sense to say, okay, we've got this $25 trillion debt here. Maybe what we ought to do is have more people in here working and paying the taxes to pay off the debt, and then we all be better off from having a lower tax burden. Again, you don't see much talk about that, but it's something that it makes some rational sense. Now, what Buchanan and Wagner were saying is that, you know what, if people had a public acceptance of the classical theory of debt, that is Adam Smith's idea that, well, what you ought to do is the government ought to run debts when it is paying for a long-lived project or if there's an emergency. But over time, what the government ought to do is to keep the debt within reasonable bounds, and pay off the debt when things are going well. If we had that sort of belief in that they argued that this would exhibit an inhibiting effect on the willingness of the government to go out and spend money. That is, there'd be if you accepted the classical theory, that is, in the long run, the government should try to balance its budget. It would reduce the pressure to spend. That is the political, we'll make it this way, the political pressure to spend. If we generally felt that this is going to be a problem, then what would happen is we would say, hey, let's not have our government getting so large. And if we look at historically, this does tend to happen. You guys are probably too young to remember, but what did you have in, you had the Great Recession, right? 2008, okay? Then what did Obama had what? Stimulus package, right? Pretty Keynesian idea. What are we going to do? We're going to increase government spending, we're going to reduce taxes, and what happened? Large deficits, right? So 2008, you had Obama, you had the stimulus, which actually ended up with Hillsdale getting the fastest high-speed internet in the country. Like, you probably don't know this, but Hillsdale has some of the fastest high-speed internet because part of the stimulus package was to set up a high-speed internet structure, right? So as they moved it, where was the right-of-way? The right-of-way was along the railroad. And if you sort of know historically, Hillsdale was sort of at the end of the rail line, which is what would happen is you would take the train to Hillsdale, and then they had a lot of liveries and stuff, and you'd get out, and then you'd get your buckboard or get your stagecoach or get your wagon train and go further west. So when they did the high-speed internet, ended up in Hillsdale. So like 42 Union, I don't anybody live at 42 Union? No, don't. Yeah. So they have high-speed internet there, right? So you have to pay to move it to your particular location, but it exists here in Hillsdale, and the reason was because it was end of the rail line. But anyway, that came about from the Obama stimulus package. That was part of the stimulus package that Obama had. So what happened was Obama had this big stimulus package, and guess what? Big debt. And what happened? 2010, the off-year election. In 2010, this was a part of the debate, and that what was going on was that we were running these large deficits. And this is a bad thing. Right? So this is a bad thing. And so what happened in 2010, the Republicans got 7 Senate seats and 63 House seats, just to give you an idea. So in the Republicans gained 7 Senate seats and 63 House seats. So Buchanan and Wagner were saying, you know what? If people start talking about this, if they start to have this idea that it's not a good thing for your federal government to be spending all this money and not paying for it, right? That this could end up with a political change, and in 2010, this is what happened. Now, in 2014, you had a similar thing, and it was, anybody knows about the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party was around in 2014, and what was that about? Very similar, that the government was getting too large, it was running deficits, and the Tea Party movement helped to gain seats for the Republicans in the 2014 election because of the Tea Party movement. Today, Mnuchin, Senator Mnuchin, who's a sort of a centrist Democratic senator, what has he been complaining about? He's been complaining about, hey, these bills that the president wants to pass are going to spend way too much money, and there's no way to pay for it, right? So Mnuchin's been talking about the debt. And so basically what Buchanan and Wagner are saying is that if this ends up in the political process, if you were to convince the voting public that the deficits are not a good thing, but they're rather a bad thing, then what could happen is it could swing the political election. Now, probably most people who are learning about macroeconomics, what are you focusing on? They're focusing on the Keynesian theory, right? The idea of the Austrian business cycle theory probably isn't being taught a lot of places, particularly in the high schools. Okay, and so when you come out of high school or when you come out of a college macroeconomics class, it tends to be towards this Keynesian model, which Buchanan and Wagner in 1977 was arguing would politically lend itself towards an expansion of the government, increasing deficits, and eventually increasing money supply in order to do that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So basically, pre-Keynes, you had a political limitation on what the size of your government was, right? So pre-Keynes, there's a political limitation on the size of your federal government, right? That is, people believed that excessive debt was harmful. Anybody, I don't know, in Econ 304, do they talk about modern monetary theory? Talk about that at all? No? Well, I don't know, anybody heard about modern monetary theory? Yeah, so the idea is basically that you can just create money and it doesn't cause a problem, okay? But bottom line is, pre-Keynes, the idea, as we said, is a general idea that, hey, there's a political limitation on what the size of your government can do, because what's going to happen is that if transfer payments or different expenditure issues have to be paid for by taxes, you guys are going to have some constraints on what you're going to think is a good idea. Okay? If it just happens that as you guys can get the Butterfly Museum for Hillsdale because Congressman Wahlberg can get it for you, and you don't have to raise your taxes, then you'll be for an increase in the spending in order to create the Butterfly Museum. So they made the point that if you put the Keynesian framework into this macroeconomic model, the idea of this macro model is really just, if it's a policy prescription to a benevolent dictator, right? That's going to be different than if you fit it within a public choice framework. So if you think about what do you learn about in Econ 304 or Econ 203, what do you learn? You learn that, okay, I've got this idea that the economy could get stuck at less than full employment. So I've got some price index, and I've got an aggregate demand curve. I've got an aggregate supply curve. And I'm going to shift this aggregate demand curve out here to full employment. This is equilibrium. What do you sort of think about? What you're really thinking about is that somehow the policymaker knows what the economy's model looks like. They know do you have a good model or not. And they know what full employment looks like, right? What is full employment output, right? Is it 20 trillion a year? Is it 10 trillion a year? Is it 30 trillion a year? What is full employment, right? When you're acting like when you take Keynesian macroeconomics, you're acting like you sort of know where this is, right? And you know what the equation of the consumption, investment, and government spending is. And so if you can get the model right, then what do? You say, okay, here's how much government spending ought to be, here's how much taxes ought to be, here's what the interest rate ought to be, right? So somehow that you model government spending, taxes, and interest rates to get aggregate demand equaling aggregate supply at full employment, right? That's what your model is. But that sort of presumes that whoever's running the Fed, and by the way, what's going on right now, right? They're going to they're deciding whether to reappoint the Federal Reserve Chair or whether they're going to have somebody else in there. Is Biden going to go on with the the Republican who in the Federal Reserve? Are they going to put their new person in, et cetera? Okay, but if the Federal Reserve Chair has the ability to determine what the interest rate is, okay, or at least affect what the interest rate is, right? The Open Market Committee, actually makes that decision. But if they can do that, then what's the idea? The idea is that somehow, in an absence of a public choice framework, that here's what we're going to do. We're going to go out, and you guys are going to go to get your PhD in economics. You're going to specialize in macroeconomic policy, and you're going to figure out what the model is, and then you're going to go advise the benevolent dictator on, okay, here's what government spending and taxes ought to be, okay? But Buchanan and Wagner say, you know what, that's not the way it works, does it? How does it really work? Is that if we look at the public choice framework, what do you have? You have rent seeking, right? I'm going to be out there trying to to get advantages for my particular company. Let's say I'm Tesla, okay? And I'm going to say, hey, what we need to do is we need to give everybody $7,500 in tax credits if they buy a Tesla car, okay? So if what we do is we say, okay, we're going to reduce taxes, what could I do? I could reduce taxes by having Tesla cars get $7,500. Or I could have, what's that new car company that came out with an R that just went public? the other day, and it's now has larger value than General Motors? Anybody know? Yeah, Rivian. Okay, so is that what it is? Yeah, whatever that is. So, maybe, okay, they're going to get a big credit, right? So what we'll have, you're going to have rent seeking, right? And what do you have? You have a bureaucracy. And what do these things both want to do, right? Bureaucracy, they're going to want to maximize the size of the budget. And rent seeking, they're going to want to reduce taxes or get government spending for their particular issue, right? If I want to have the Green New Deal, I want to have that my solar power field or my wind turbines get a real expenditure from the government to be able to go out, and they're going to buy up the land for me, or they're going to subsidize my windmill farm or whatever. So that what's going to happen is this is going to try to increase G and make taxes go down. So what Buchanan and Wagner are saying is, no, you're not going to have, if you have this Keynesian model, you're not going to have that it's a, let's figure out what real GDP, full employment GDP is, and we'll just figure out what those numbers are, and then the benevolent dictator will plug in for G and T in interest rates. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is, if you say, here, that's the model, then what's going to happen is you're going to have rent-seeking folks out there if we say deficits are okay, right? Then what's going to happen is I'm going to have rent-seeking folks out there trying to get more expenditures and reduce taxes for them. And then you're going to have bureaucracies that are out there trying to maximize the size of their budget. And so what will happen is that you'll get a political process which leads to what? Which is going to lead to increased government spending, what we should see over time. What do we see? Government spending going up, taxes going down, deficits going up. And then what we'll talk about a little more later on is that what happens when we have this big increase in government spending and big increase in taxes, or decrease in taxes. Then what's going to happen? We're going to have to go out and we're going to have to sell bonds, right? What happens when you sell bonds? If I have more bonds out there, what happens to the price of bonds, right? Price of bonds goes down, right? But recall that the price of bonds and the interest rates move in opposite directions, right? If I have a bond that pays 5% and I have a bond that pays 10%, what's going to happen? The bond that pays 10% is going to have a different price than the bond that pays 5%, right? So what happens is they tend to move in opposite directions. So bonds that have low interest rates are less valuable than bonds that pay high interest rates. So what happens is they move in opposite directions. So when the price of bonds is going down, interest rates are going up. And then what's going to happen? The Federal Reserve is going to get bummed because people are going to start yelling at the Federal Reserve. So how can you make the interest rates go down? You can make the money supply go up, right? And we'll talk more about next time about how this mechanically happens. But sort of thinking forward, what's going to happen is the Fed's going to respond, and it's going to increase the money supply. And so what is that going to do? It's going to lead to inflation. And so what Buchanan and Wagner argue is that when you embed the Keynesian model into a public choice framework, you don't get that the benevolent dictator figures out, oh, we're at aggregate demand equaling aggregate supply at less than full employment, and this is how much G should go up, and this is how much T should go down, and here's how much the interest rate should be in order to go investment, C plus I plus G equal to full employment, and that's it. The process is going to say, okay, if I can run deficits I'm going to have rent seekers out there who are going to say, hey, I can get more stuff without having to pay the taxes. And I'm going to have bureaucrats out there wanting to maximize the size of their budget without having to increase taxes. And so what are you going to get over time? You're going to get increasing government spending. You're going to get increasing debt over time. You're going to get interest rates starting to rise over time. You're going to get inflation starting to happen over time. And so what Buchanan and Wagner are going to end up arguing is that you need to put in a sort of an alarm clock sort of thing here, which would be what? It would be sort of, think about it, it's going to be, they're going to come up with this idea of a constitutional amendment that makes it so that you have to balance the budget, right? Unless there's an emergency like a war or whatever, so the constitutional amendment to balance for a balanced budget. And that actually had a fairly strong movement for a while. There was a presentation in Michigan about that. There was almost enough states to go ahead and put it as a proposed constitutional amendment. So what we'll do for next time is we'll continue with the Buchanan and Wagner Democracy and Deficit. Remember that there's the notes for that are in your folder. I have the notes for that in that section in your folder. So go ahead and take a look at that, and we'll talk more about that on Wednesday. Oh, wait, forgot. Wait. Classic album of the week, which I didn't do last Friday, Dire Straits, okay? This is their original album. Mark Knopfler, great guitarist. This is a 1978 album. To get a look at that. And band pick of the week is Black Pumas. Anybody heard of Black Pumas? Oh my gosh. They just got nominated for Best Rhythm and Blues Band of the Year. So Black Pumas is the band pick of the week for this week. All right.